Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 120, A Less Toxic Conversation. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as we continue this series looking at the role of Israel in the present and future of American Judaism, we are talking to Melissa Weintraub. She is the founding co-executive director of an organization called Resetting the Table, which is dedicated to building dialogue and deliberation across political divides. Its emphasis has been on building dialogue and deliberation across the divides relating to Israel, but it's branching out and seeing the need for doing that more broadly. Melissa was also the founding director of Encounter, an organization, in its own words, dedicated to strengthening the capacity of the Jewish people to be agents of change in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After working for many years through Encounter on building bridges between Jews and Palestinians, Melissa turned her attention to building bridges between Jews and Jews, in light of what we've already talked about in this series in terms of the toxic conversation about Israel in the Jewish community. Resetting the Table is trying to detoxify that conversation. Certainly an important and interesting task. Melissa Weintraub was ordained as a conservative rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she is also an alum of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship Program. Melissa has lectured and taught in hundreds of Jewish communal institutions, universities, and forums, and has served as a faculty member for the Wexner Foundation and the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. We're thrilled to have Melissa on the podcast today to talking about Israel. Melissa, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here.
So I think that it would be great to get started with just a little bit of a primer on what Resetting the Table is all about and why you created it, when you created it, what does it do, etc.
Resetting the Table works to build courageous communication across political divides. We have a methodology and toolkit that applies mediation theory and practice to help participants talk about the thorny things that matter most, including Israel, but not limited to Israel, charged issues that matter, that are hard to address, even in the face of really strong and passionate political differences. And we have brought together more than 17,000 Jews across a pretty staggering range of backgrounds and views to grapple together and challenge each other and make decisions together in partnership with hundreds of Jewish institutions. In our first years, we were laser focused on the American Jewish conversation around Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And after the 2016 election, we really felt like we had to bring our tools and approach to addressing red, blue, purple divides in our country more broadly, but still about 80% of what we do focuses on Israel, Palestine. I should probably throw in here, from the get-go, that language around this issue is loaded, to say the least. Someone says, Israel, Palestine, Judea and Samaria, fence, wall, barrier, and many people's minds immediately think, oh, you're one of those. And I'm going to be alternating language and formulations, in different parts of our conversation. So the name Resetting the Table actually came from a caption contest on Facebook. At that point, we were building a project, a new paradigm of robust, welcoming, compelling, young adult Israel conversation and learning. I was really making an argument that I've been making probably since about 2006, hearkening back to a study, a landmark study that the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Philanthropies released called Israel in an Age of M&M, that anticipates a lot of the studies about young Jews that have come out since and mirrors the results of Ari Kelman's research, which I know has come up in other episodes, and anticipated a lot of what Peter Beinart argued a few years later. And what it basically found was that young Jews want honest recognition of our people's diversity of opinion, and they want productive channels for engaging with that diversity. They want to explore it open-endedly. They want to talk about it. They want to grapple with it with each other. So they found a kind of aversion to both the tone and tenor of the conversation and to the terms of the conversation. The tone meaning all the noise and unpleasantness and ugliness of how people are treating each other across their differences on this issue. And the terms of the conversation, meaning that they found a lot of Israel engagement to be presumptuous and patronizing. Presumptuous and patronizing in the sense of a kind of spoon-feeding heavy-handedly and not empowering them to draw their own conclusions and to figure out for themselves what they think. We presented this argument to the task force, and they bought our diagnosis of the problem as well as our vision for building a paradigm of young adult Israel conversation and learning that would be welcoming and compelling and thoughtful and multivocal, that would empower people to reach their own conclusions, that would be unafraid to tackle the hard stuff head on. And the reason that we called it Resetting the Table, the reason we were drawn to that name when it came up, is because this was essentially an inside game. This was about changing the communal table from within how Israel is taught and discussed and learned about and engaged within existing communal structures, reconfiguring on some level the communal table as a whole on multiple levels. Who's at the table? What are they doing when they're there? How are they communicating with each other and taking in what each other has to say? How are they making decisions together? A vision of a kind of deliberative democracy, if you will, in Jewish life. Resetting the table, no, we didn't say overturning the table or tearing the table down. This was really about a kind of incremental and subtle and collaborative working with, as opposed to working against, communal institutions to change the way that Israel is done in the Jewish community as a whole.
You alluded to this, but who is at the table? Who are at your tables when you're doing this work? I know that by the sound of it, you're reaching people of all sorts of different ages and through a variety of contexts. But I guess if you could give us a little bit of a sense of who is involved when you're mediating or constructing these spaces around new forms of dialogue.
So we've worked with more than 20 federations and JCRCs, and often what the work will look like with a federation or JCRC when we enter a new city is to begin with a convening of a cross-section of people who are coming from many, many different corners of the community and who aren't often in the same room together, who even have had active conflict. And so picture federation board members who pushed the federation to take a stance in opposition to the Iran deal, and major donors who withdrew six-figure gifts as a result, and lay leaders who pushed the JCC to invite Peter Beinart to speak, and lay leaders who got him uninvited, and religious Zionist Orthodox rabbis and anti-occupation activists, and the head of an organization that just brought an evangelical speaker that many perceive as homophobic, and the head of an LGBTQ organization that's no longer speaking to them as a result. So picture all of those people in a room together. That's one version of what this can look like. I have to say I like demonstrating our work much more than talking about it. I'd much rather be reading you and everyone listening around the table.
When I think about what you're describing, I'm wondering if what you're doing, what you're often brought in to do, is to try to help solve a problem, a sort of immediate problem that is occurring, right? The community is being torn apart by these different groups that are fighting with one another, and the leaders of that community are bringing you in to try to help them fix it? Or is it more that you're brought in to sort of model an approach that perhaps can be over time integrated into the community so that those kinds of tearing aparts don't happen, in a sort of train the trainers type of methodology? Or I assume it's both, but I guess I'm asking, when do they tend to pick up the red phone and call you?
It is both. We are not in the putting out fires business. We are in the business of building the muscles and capacity to do our differences differently and better rather than so poorly. And there's a ripening effect. So we can't be everywhere at once. We're actually quite bottlenecked by demand for this work. And so we don't knock on a lot of doors. And often when a community comes to us, it's because a lot of volatility has happened and escalation, or they're just tired of all of the avoidance. And they see how costly the avoidance and disengagement has gotten because things are so fraught and charged. Or they see other communities that have fallen apart and they want to do something preventative. I mean, that is more rare for people to be preventative and proactive about conflict.
Can you talk a little bit about, why is the situation the way it is? Why is the conversation about Israel so toxic? Because I think about Spinoza being excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam because he had views about God or the authorship of the Bible or whatever, that nowadays it's like, yeah, you can think whatever you want about that. I mean, the idea that Spinoza was excommunicated for something as mundane as having different views about God seems kind of almost laughable today. And yet the spirit of that excommunication is alive and well. It's just been applied to Israel. And I'm wondering why communities end up in sort of toxic style conversations about subjects in general, and why in particular Israel is that subject in the Jewish community today.
There's a saying that Jews are just like everyone else, only more so. And I do think that this issue has to be put into a fuller context of the intensity of polarization in American life more broadly. American society is more polarized than at any point since the Civil War, according to many markers, ideological siloing and partisan antipathy among them. Siloing penetrates every dimension of our lives, from where we live to who we marry to what church we join to what synagogue we join. We are often inhibited from hiring and loaning money to, finding attractive, even helping those in need across political lines, more so than any other difference in American life. So Israel is the most acute manifestation of what could be called, a kind of underlying societal sickness that's happening in America more broadly, as to why is Israel the most acute manifestation of those patterns in America. I had a colleague in this work that once said that Jews get so crazy about Israel because people on the left and the right think if you don't agree with me, we're all going to get killed. I think there's something to that. I could explicate how that plays itself out, even among people who think that they're primarily moved more morally than pragmatically by danger. But I do think there is something of that fear and anxiety, hyperreactivity that comes from a Jewish history of persecution and trauma. And, I'm not an expert in trauma, so I'm kind of talking out of school here on some level, but my understanding of trauma is that it predisposes us to have a hard time distinguishing between safety and danger. And I want to be really careful here to say that it doesn't mean that all sense of peril or danger is overblown or irrational, but it becomes hard to tell the difference between things that are minor threats or major threats or even innocuous. And there's a strong correlation actually with autoimmune disorders. What's an autoimmune disorder? It's basically the body attacking and destroying itself, and including its own healthy tissues by mistake, because it can't tell the difference between safety and danger. And I was just thinking recently, it's an interesting metaphor for the Jewish communal conversation on Israel, the autoimmune disorder, as a body that's kind of attacking and destroying itself. And that goes for PR firms that are engaging in smear campaigns and character assassination against individuals that are just utter lovers of the Jewish people. I think it also can go for the parts of the left overgeneralizing about the establishment and turning the establishment into a boogeyman. As someone who works a lot with mainstream Jewish institutions, I think that there can be this kind of over-the-top demonization that covers over a lot of nuance and integrity of people in mainstream institutions, both who are actually doing already the things that they're being called to do, or that simply disagree with the analysis and prescriptions of people on the left. And that doesn't make them cowardly ostriches with their heads in the sand or villains who aren't worth talking to. But it's about more than agreeing to disagree. This isn't about politeness. This is about thoroughly probing and investigating our differences in full to see what they have to teach us, to use them as a springboard for greater insight and creativity, to engage them directly rather than tiptoe around them or to escalate around them. It's not about moderation or compromise or papering over our differences in common ground. And, one of the other things that we will sometimes say to help people wrap their minds around this is less about common ground than it is about meeting ground. It's really about meeting ground and common grappling among divergent viewpoints, pushing and challenging each other, as well as affirming each other's dignity in the process.
I guess for me, one critique I hear very frequently, not of resetting the table in particular, but in general, I hear from many folks, and sometimes I feel it myself, is that the word dialogue and words like conversation have become very complicated. And for some, they've become almost equivalent to sort of inaction. And there are people that are actually really upset at the idea of simply talking about a complicated, important issue like Israel-Palestine, because for them, it may imply it's not that it's totally a zero-sum game, but it may imply that the dialogue is sort of taking place of concrete action. And I think there's people that feel that way, and there's people that feel the exact opposite and really think that the dialogue is a prerequisite for important action. And I guess I'd just love to hear how you engage with folks who think that way, because I would presume that many of them are ones that end up in your rooms.
There's a lot of things to say. One is that as we see it, there need to be an ecosystem of approaches. There's not only one approach of what's needed. We are not in any way telling people don't take action. On the contrary, we want people to fight for their visions of the world that they want to be living in, their vision of justice, their vision of the Jewish people, whatever it is. And we want them to have meeting ground where they are in conversation with each other for the sake of their own political effectiveness, their capacity to reach new people, their capacity for their messaging to land, et cetera. So I can go back to that, but our work is about dialogue purism. We're not going to push people to take actions under our rubric, but we want to empower and encourage people to take action under other rubrics. And there's a couple important things to say in addition to this. One is, one of the things that's behind that critique on the left is a sense of urgency, a sense of while we're having this conversation, people are dying, and, that this can be navel gazing, it can be a distraction, it can be paralyzing when there's a lot of suffering happening. And I think that has to be, really considered and engaged and thought through, and people are suffering. If I thought that there was a fast way to change everything, I probably wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing. But I actually think that all urgency all the time often actually ends up being counterproductive. I'll add another concept into the mix. John Paul Lederach, who's one of the great scholars and living practitioners of conflict transformation, who studied how do societies get out of protracted conflict all over the globe, has an idea that he's introduced of critical yeast versus critical mass. Critical mass is basically about mobilizing like-minded people. Critical yeast is the smallest element that all the other ingredients need to rise. And it's about often a quality of relationship among strange bedfellows, improbable people. And it's much harder to achieve, but everything else can't rise without it. We see dialogue work as part of critical yeast.
This has been really fascinating so far. I'm curious to hear what got you interested in this work in the first place. There's thousands of people who encounter Israel and Palestine in one sense or another, and the route they take is not usually to end up mediating conflicts between folks of a wide variety of perspectives like you are at Resetting the Table. It's usually they become involved in activism in one place or another. Maybe a few of them become scholars or teachers. I don't know, but you've carved out maybe not a completely unique, but a rare kind of niche for yourself. And I'm curious, sort of what's brought you to that place? How did you come to a spot where you really cared passionately about shifting how Israel-Palestine conversations happen?
In the years before founding Resetting the Table, I was directing another organization called Encounter that works to build the capacity of the Jewish people to be positive agents of change in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. More concretely, the flagship program brings influential groups of Jewish leaders into the West Bank to meet with Palestinians on the ground. And we always called that work a double encounter. People would come who were never in the same room together in the US or who avoided each other like the plague. And they would say that they had been marked and impacted and challenged by their conversations with each other alongside their encounter with Palestinian experience and realities on the ground. So we wanted to create that magic writ large and build it into Jewish institutional and communal life on this soil. And that was part of the genesis of Resetting the Table. You know, in terms of where this comes from in me personally, I don't fully know. You know, there's something inscrutable about our journeys. I did grow up in a small town in the Midwest where I was kind of outside the common paradigm just by being brunette. And I think I always had bifocal vision as a result, you know, kind of being inside and outside and being a translator shuttling between worlds. And that's just like very much something that's embedded in me dispositionally. And so, you know, I was always doing dialogue work of some kind or other, whether it was with Native Americans or evangelicals or Muslims or, you know, any number of people different than myself. So, you know, I'm a dialogue junkie. Like it's very, very much embedded in who I am. I think that I also saw that, you know, there's a spiritual and religious component of this work to me. We say in our Yom Kippur liturgy, Shafachnu kamayim avnei libot. We have poured out our stone hearts like water. And I sometimes, you know, think of my life's work as helping people pour out their stone hearts like water, whether that's Jews and Palestinians sitting before each other exchanging stories, or it's social justice activists from elite colleges sitting with Trump supporters without college degrees, and the pouring out of assumptions that happens, the pouring out of what's hardened in us to each other's integrity and complexity and dignity. So there's a famous text about two schools of competing thought, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, who argued ferociously for years, and then a divine voice came down and said, these are words of the living God. And, you know, what happens next goes to your question about the relationship between dialogue and action. Like, we can't go this way and that way. So even though there's this recognition of a kind of metaphysical pluralism, or at least a recognition that the truth is not fully graspable by us, that we're all limited and biased, we still have to act, right? We still have to legislate, we still have to do things, but on what basis should we act, given that we have this limitation and bias, and the basis is, first of all, epistemic humility, like to have humility about what we do and don't know, to hold out the possibility that we may be wrong, that we may not be seeing parts of the picture, to pursue the thinking of those who disagree with us, to chase after it, to, if we think we know who the bad guys are, to step into their shoes, to have them inform our thinking. Again, none of that should paralyze us from acting, but we should at least be able to reconstruct the thinking of those with whom we disagree on their own terms.
I'm flashing selfishly back to some of my own experiences as we human beings like to do sometimes in conversations. And I'm thinking of some conversations I organized actually in Jackson, Mississippi. I was living there for a couple of years. And through the congregation in town, there's one synagogue in town, I approached the rabbi and said, can I start an Israel literacy series? I chose the name very intentionally. I wanted it to be about learning and conversation and education and not about advocacy. And we ended up doing it, and we had, I think, 9 or 10. We did a monthly set of sessions over the course of a little more than a year. And I co-ran it with somebody who's, I mean, I'm pretty far to the left, as nobody who listens is going to be surprised by. And I co-hosted it with somebody who was very much not. And it was a deep challenge for me and a deep struggle. And I also think that it was valuable for a lot of the people in the room. But I guess as I look back on it, there's so many pieces that I, even a couple of years later, would have done differently. But I'm certain that if you were looking in on it with all of the experiences you had, not that we did some terrible job, but that you would probably have some really helpful pointers for how a congregational conversation like this could work. So I guess I'm curious, like, I'd encourage everybody to approach you for more intensive, longer term learning on this front. But for our listeners, what are just sort of 1 or 2 practical tips that you would lead off with for folks that are trying to shift how their Israel conversations look in a congregational context or otherwise?
It's actually difficult work to open the Pandora's box of our differences. It's why we don't do it, or do it in ways that are escalatory most of the time. And we haven't found shortcuts to knowing in foolproof ways that we can produce quality conversation without facilitators. So like our secret sauce is built a lot around facilitators and communication capacity building. But that's, there's a lot of people out there who it's not practical to bring in third-party facilitators. And so, want existing resources or want tips, want to know like, what can we do? And I hesitate sometimes to throw them out because we can't guarantee there's going to be a quality conversation that ensues without facilitators in the room. So something that's very easy to do without trained facilitators present are storytelling modalities. It can be great for people simply to bring into the room a more holistic understanding of who each other is as human beings and what informs their thinking, what are the underlying motivations and values and life experiences that have shaped each other. We have do-it-yourself storytelling modalities, some of which can be done around dinner tables, some of which can be done on the stage. And it really helps people see each other's complexity and humanity more fully. When people take on educational programming, like what you were describing in Israel literacy, what we find is one of the crucial pieces is that multiple points of view are presented, different sources of evidence and information and ways of narrating that information, and that you have the most generous possible representation of each of those divergent viewpoints. So everybody feels like they can see themselves in the material, which lowers a lot of defenses. And there's also a process put in place that enables people to try new things on. When we have a series of educational classes, one that's on the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that's on where do we go from here in Israeli-Palestinian relations. And when we're training educators and facilitators to teach those classes, we really work at them to be able to articulate whatever thinking isn't their own in the most sympathetic way possible. Because when you do that, then it really helps everyone to be their most receptive and flexible toward the things that they disagree with.
I'm not sure what the right metaphors are sometimes to sort of play around with in something like this, but just to sort of play devil's advocate, I'm thinking a little bit about a metaphor of just being in a bad relationship, and maybe sometimes, you've had some counseling and some mediation, and now it's time to say, what, do I really need to be in this relationship? And I just wonder about the assumption that a lot of, I think, this vitriol is about, which comes from both sides, let's say, and not only in the Israel-Palestine debate, but others as well, that somehow there has to be a single Jewish communal way, and what we're fighting about is what that way is going to be, as opposed to some version of saying, let's go back to the time when there were the 2 monarchies or the 12 tribes, or even looking at the subject that got Spinoza excommunicated. It seems like we've reached a sort of accommodation with regard to God or religious practice where we've said, what, we don't have to fight with the Orthodox about whether or not they should be egalitarian. We'll just won't go to that one. And I guess I'm just trying to sort of tease that out in my own mind, and I'm not sure that I exactly have a question, but I think that you know what I'm getting at. I'm looking for your help a little bit in asking this question about, well, maybe there's another approach as well, that it's also okay to say to the other group, perhaps, you should live and be well and do your own thing, and I don't have to talk with you. And I get right, and I know that that's a little bit anathema to the perspective of dialogue, but I guess I'm wondering, how that lands on you and where you go with those ideas.
Yeah. So I go a few different directions. One is I don't think that the only options are unity or schism. And we exist, in part to give people options besides unity, certainly a unity of uniformity, or let's just all fragment into our respective fiefdoms and never talk to each other again. The form of mediation that we draw from is actually a response in part to forms of mediation that push people or coerce parties toward particular conclusions, including staying in relationship, like forms of negotiation and mediation that got people to the table and tried to get them to make agreements and compromises and to push them toward outcomes that they weren't entirely happy with themselves, without actually changing the relationship, the way they communicated, the way they saw each other, but just to, get a deal. As far as we're concerned, people can certainly, mutually decide to go their separate ways. We want people to make that decision on the basis of good communication and of seeing each other clearly. And often when that's the case, then people don't make that decision actually, after all. But I'll say something more concretely. I have never said this out loud before, actually, so hopefully it'll be coherent. But I've been observing in our work that there is a tension between moral clarity and a value of inclusivity, and that plays itself out in lots of different kinds of communities. It plays itself out in communities that are progressive dominated, and it plays itself out in communities that are right of center or center dominated. And whoever kind of has the existing hegemony, or at least dominance, tends to advocate for moral clarity. And whoever is disempowered in that space tends to advocate for inclusivity. I think that there are a lot of Judaisms to be built, and there are so few meeting grounds in American life or American Jewish life. Like, it's really an endangered species that should be protected, the politically diverse community. And most communities, if you start overturning some stones, it turns out are politically diverse, even if they don't look like it, at a first pass. And if everybody fragments and we have the AIPAC shul and the J Street shul and the Trump shul and what have you, then everybody loses their capacity for their voices to reach further than their little island and bubble. People don't have their thinking sharpened and clarified and pushed and challenged. And I think that there's also just, there's a lot of societal broader costs as well, beyond just relationship. Like when you have schisms at that level, societies start edging toward violence and civil war. And, I don't want to overstate this. I don't think Jews are going to start attacking each other violently, but there's something violent in the spirit of that, to hell with you. That's become so much the mood of the moment.
I'm flashing to the study I saw, and hopefully I can dig it up for the show notes, but it was from a long time ago. And what I remember it indicating was they looked at people taking standardized tests. And this isn't a commentary on standardized tests. I think very poor things about them. But for people who considered arguments for each of the four options, or however many options, if they had to consider like how you would make the case for each of the options, they actually answered correctly on a more frequent basis than those who didn't do that. And for me, as much as I live deeply with that tension you just elaborated on between clarity and inclusivity. And there are some days where I don't feel particularly inclusive, and I struggle with that. And there are other days where I do. But I think that really is a human truth. And that when we dig deep and try to understand how one would make the argument, even if you think it's a terrible one, but like make the least terrible one for that case. And I think it can actually empower you to think more deeply about why you hold the point you do have. But when Dan asked about the name of your organization, and when I had considered your name, maybe it's because I'm a Jewish nerd, but I somehow assumed that there was going to be some interesting backstory. Really, this is Lex being very nerdy, about this text called the Shulchan Aruch. Because Shulchan Aruch means set table, ultimately. And it's this big ticket Jewish text that in the world of Jewish texts and communities that found themselves on the idea of Jewish legal authority, it sort of wins a lot of those arguments. It like dictates in a big way a lot of what Jewish legal life looks like. And so from an angle of, it sets out a set table. It sets out, this is the way. And I was curious. You don't have to talk about the Shulchan Aruch in your answer, but like I'm curious. Going back to the name a little bit, we're resetting the table. I feel like that could be interpreted in two ways. One, like the way that we have set the table is off, and also like maybe it's actually not just about setting a new correct table, but the premise that there is no one correct way to set the table. I'd love to hear if that resonates or if it informs the work that you're doing that sounds really powerful.
Definitely resonates and does not inform until this moment. Now it can inform. It made me think of a teaching from Rabbi Joel Roth, who is a professor of Jewish law at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I remember that he once said that the evolution of Jewish law was always a chess game, until the Shulchan Aruch, at which point someone took a dome and put it on top of the chessboard and froze all the pieces. And, so I haven't ever thought about this before, but on some level, resetting the table is about pulling off that dome and getting back to the game. When we're not overthrowing the table, we're saying, let's play the game again. Let's move around the pieces and do what Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish did to probably first century rabbis who sought out disconfirmation of their thinking more than who didn't want a corroboration of their thinking or a yes man. The text goes that Rabbi Yochanan, when Reish Lakish died, that he was replaced by an intellectual partner who just confirmed everything that he thought, and so he entered into a state of grief because he realized that Reish Lakish had answered him with 24 objections for everything that he thought. And so it gave them both a fuller understanding of the law. That kind of irreducible complexity that doesn't paralyze us from acting, but still interrogates everything that we think. Heterodoxy, viewpoint diversity is and was so deeply part of Jewish tradition.
So, Melissa, one question that I have, and I'm not totally sure how to formulate it, but it really has to do with the people who don't connect to, let's say, the mainstream American Jewish institutions, religious institutions, and other kinds of institutions. And I think that one thing that surfaced for me as we were having some of our earlier conversations in this series was that Israel was a kind of alternative for a generation or two to those religious institutions, something that people could rally around and feel Jewish about, even when they didn't feel religious and didn't connect to synagogues. And something has happened such that doesn't seem to be as possible anymore for a younger generation and even many members of an older generation. Part of that story has to do with the environment of talking about Israel being such a toxic thing. It can't be something that I'm going to connect to. I mean, I'm going to stay away from that, and I guess I'm wondering how your work connects with all that, especially since it takes place, I think, largely in the organized Jewish community. Clearly, if you were successful, it would have a positive impact on that. But I mean, are there other things that can be done sort of for, with and for the folks who are not actively engaged in the institutions of the American Jewish community?
When we were first getting started, UJA Federation, who was our first partner really wanted us to target Jews who were driven away and disengaged. And we said that we want to target Jewish institutions and broadly defined Jewish institutions, from Hillels to social justice organizations like Chazon and Avodah to rabbinical schools, because we wanted to change institutions from the inside so that they became more appealing and compelling and welcoming to all kinds of Jews, rather than to try to build this kind of alternative home on the outside. I think is a big part of your show. There's all kinds of obstacles to Jewish organizations and institutions being compelling to a lot of young Jews on all kinds of grounds. But we have seen this as an outcome of our work pretty consistently. So on campuses that we've worked on, Hillel professionals will say that there are students showing up who were never showing up to do Israel programming before. There's a lot of different kinds of alienation. There's the alienation from institutions that people who are highly engaged feel. And then there's people who are truly disengaged altogether from the conversation, which often looks like apathy and isn't necessarily apathy. And our work has touched those people, but both sets of people, both demographics, but really is about targeting the people who are leading institutions to try to create a different kind of culture within them.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is that a lot of times this is framed, and the Jewish community is sort of thought of as basically taking right of center positions on Israel. And so the folks who are, the ones that are not in power and that are kind of the ones that are saying, that they're the excluded are the left. And, there's a lot of talk about what the right is doing wrong. And I was just curious, since you're in the kind of world of mediation where, it's important to sort of understand where, not that both parties are equally right or wrong, but that there's contribution from both directions. I'm curious if you could sort of talk a little bit about where you, as someone who has done work on what's called on the left before, like where do you see the left not necessarily doing what they ought to be doing in order to contribute, I guess in your sense, like to contribute either to the dialogue or to the positive resolution of what they're trying to resolve?
We have found that the patterns of feeling excluded and marginalized and shut down apply to very much to people often in the center and right of center and right in many communities, particularly on campus and social justice dominated communities. But the experience of being ostracized or labeled or put in a box and any number of other like destructive dynamics, many people, right of center people experience as well. And, we get suspicions from across the political spectrum about our work. Increasingly, when we first started this work, we got more suspicions from the right, and now, recently the suspicions have been coming more from the left. But relatedly, in terms of what people who lean left can do, I think there's too much attack and castigation and shaming in the equation. A lot of people on the left carry like really understandable wounds and resentment and anger about ways that their education left out parts of the picture, or ways that they were excluded or ostracized. And it's entirely understandable, but when on the basis of those painful or infuriating experiences, there can be a tendency to paint the organized Jewish community with one brush and not to appreciate the nuances and integrity and serious efforts of many on the inside of the community. And when people feel attacked and misrepresented, they tend to get more defensive. This isn't about playing nice. I think it's absolutely the precondition to people on the left being more effective. Relatedly, agitation can move things forward in social change movements, but there has been too much privileging of agitation over a lot of other kinds of strategies. I will say that I think that If Not Now's agitational strategy of You Never Told Me has been very effective at cracking open a lot of awareness and being a catalyst for change. And we've gotten contacted by Jewish educational institutions all over the country as a result, saying, help us, because our students are saying we never told them things. And that, it kind of goes to the inside-outside strategy, because If Not Now's prescriptions for what educational institutions should be doing aren't ones that are mission aligned with those institutions, really. I mean, on some level, they just replace one advocacy paradigm with another. Educational institutions should be empowering students to understand why are there parts of the Jewish people that see this territory as occupied, as well as, most of the international legal community. And why are there parts of the Jewish people, and why is it the official position of the Israeli government that this territory is disputed? And why are there parts of the Jewish, even within the constituency that sees this territory as occupied, why are there differences of opinion about how much will or how much agency Israel has to actually change the status quo, and how much does Israeli will matter? And so, an educational institution should empower students to understand all of those different perspectives and to grapple with them and to reach their own conclusions. And, the awakening through the agitational strategy is helpful, as well as then some strategy that helps in an institution that has diverse stakeholders and a mission to integrate the critique into the way they do things.
My sort of question about this, though, is I get it, and I don't disagree, but I'm also curious about the fact, and I guess this is like the issue here is that an eye for an eye and the whole world is blind. But, one of the issues about taking the approach that says, I want to talk to you, as opposed to I want to agitate against you, is that the attitude towards some of the left, is at least the far left, from certain institutions like Hillel, has been to ban them, and to say we won't talk to you, we won't have you. So then, is the right approach to sort of keep trying to talk, or is there a point at which agitation is really necessary in order to force open the conversation? I mean, I assume that's what they would say they're trying to do. Let's say in a case where the institution is in a more powerful position, a federation, a Hillel, what are the, or if it was an institution on the left and it was the flip side, and they take a position that sort of says, we deem you as having crossed over the line that we consider to basically be within the zone of our belief in what's valid. And in some ways, we're putting you outside of our community.
I do think that there's a place for agitation. There's moments to walk through the door, there's moments to knock on the door, there's moments to push on the door, and, there's probably moments to barrel down the door forcefully, aggressively. What I was objecting to is going to agitation as a first resort. There's a preponderance on the left these days, not only in the Jewish world, of particular community organizing strategies that can be really dehumanizing toward adversaries, and a lot of thinking of, they can't be talked to, they can only be shamed and brought down, and they won't give up power voluntarily. And I think a lot of that is counterproductive, as well as contradictory to a lot of, progressive ideals about human dignity. Coming back to your specific example around Hillel, so this is work that we do, that kind of inside institutional work of how can change be created. And it's not about individuals saying, oh, you cast me out, and I'm going to keep meekly coming back to try to have a place at the table. There's institutional change that can be created on this question. And it generally looks like the institution collecting data about the diversity of its constituency, and the people who are stakeholders in that institution clarifying their values and what they stand for, and then looking at the consequences, including the unintended consequences of different courses of action. So what is going to happen if we put down red lines? And there are a lot of unintended consequences to red lines, as well as institutions that have relaxed all boundaries have also had negative unintended consequences. This is a really complex issue, but there are ways to take an institution through a process where it's looking at what the consequences are for its own mission and objectives when it excludes people who are supposed to be part of the constituency that it represents, and also what happens when it becomes open to the point that it doesn't actually make explicit boundaries that probably are present without making them explicit, and which can also create a different kind of paralysis.
So this has been such a great conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Melissa Weintraub, for joining us. This has been awesome.
It was my pleasure.
And we want to close out this episode with one more thank you, and that goes to all of you out there listening. So thank you so much. It really means the world to us that you're tuning in. And we want to close out the episode as we always do by letting you know a few ways to get in touch with us. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can try us on Twitter at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us with a financial donation, either on a one-time basis or a monthly recurring basis. And you can do either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.